I'm here.
All right. The first lesson comes from Genesis 6:5 through 7:5. I'm going to read the first part through verse 16, and then Sam's going to pick up from there. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how long you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark, and make lower, middle, and upper decks.
I am going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you and will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you and be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. The Lord then said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. We also have an epistle reading from 1 Peter 3:18 through 22. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was to put death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him.
Great. Thank you, Jerry and Sam, for reading those passages for us. Have you ever felt like you were drowning? You know, one of the most traumatic memories I have from my childhood was as an early elementary kid taking swimming lessons at the local middle school. I hated it. It was an old building that smelled bad. It was kind of like Briscoe, if you know what I mean. And there was this cold pool with chipped tiles. And on Saturday mornings, I would join some of my friends, and we had to go and in the cold locker room, change into our swim trunks, and I would be trembling, partly out of the chilliness of the room, but also just out of fear of what was coming next. I hated it. Even today, the smell of chlorine just makes me uncomfortable. We would go into the pool. I remember one exercise we had to do, which I didn't mind so much, because this exercise, you got to cling to the side of the pool, and I held to those tiles with white knuckles. They were called bob-ups, and you had to lift your head up and down out of the water and breathe. And I thought, oh, I can do this all right. But when it came time to venture out into the deep water where I couldn't touch the bottom, I was terrified. I would cling to the instructor and kind of climb up on their shoulders and head. I just hated it. I didn't know why, but it was not a positive experience. Well, even to this day, I really don't like swimming. I can get in the water and float around, and I like to play with my kids in the ocean or at lakes, but mostly I feel an uncomfortableness. When I get in, I realize that somehow I forgot to breathe. There's a tightness in my chest and my body's tight. I swim kind of like a really fast thrown stone. If I hit the water just right, I can bounce along the top for a little bit, but then eventually I just sink. I don't like swimming. It was some years after I took those lessons that I learned a story from my mom. She told me about one sunny afternoon when I was about 2 years old, and our grandparents took us to a local beach at a lake. And having fun with my siblings, I followed my older sister off the end of a dock right into the water. And I didn't know how to swim. I was just doing what my sister did. And I don't know how long I was under, but it was long enough for my grandfather to realize I was missing. He went to look for me and pulled me up. And when I heard that story, I thought, oh, well, it's no wonder I don't like being in the water. It feels like just being in it reminds me somewhere deep in my bones of being surrounded, overwhelmed with something I couldn't control, something that was threatening to undo me. Pretty scary feeling. Well, as you have heard from the Giacometti's beautiful telling and pictures of that story, we're talking about Noah and the flood today. Noah's story is a very familiar one to us. It's kind of become the stuff of nursery rhymes and tales that we put in children's rooms. But it's a pretty frightening tale, actually. And another thing that's interesting about this is that it is just one of the great flood stories among the world's religions and cultures. In fact, ancient Greece and Mesopotamia and Babylon had flood tales. We'll talk about those in a moment. But also Hindu texts in India and Norse mythology in Scandinavia, Aboriginal tribes in southern Australia and the Canary Confederation in Ecuador, Mayan people in Central America, and here right in our own land, Ojibwe and Ottawa and other Algonquin tribes, as well as Cree and Micmac and Lakota and Anishinaabe and Hopi, Inuit, Eskimo, all have stories of great floods. Mostly in these Native American tales, it has to do with a great evil serpent who, in his dying actions, stirs up the water and floods the world, threatening mankind. But the question that we have to ask is, what do we make of the flood? Was there a global flood? Do these stories suggest that it was the case at one point the entire world was covered over with floodwaters? These fellas here, John Whitcomb and Henry Morris, they wrote a book in 1961 claiming just that from the geological evidence, they thought that, yeah, indeed, there was a flood that covered the entire world. I think they're off on that, and mostly the scientific and theological community is of one mind that there probably wasn't a flood that covered the entire earth. And when you think about the authors of these great ancient stories, when they thought of the world, they didn't have globes. They didn't grow up going to grade school and looking at globes or have that picture in their mind of the beautiful earth as a blue marble floating in the sky. No, the world for them meant their world. And there is actually evidence of many, many local floods that undid individuals' worlds, but probably not covered the entire globe. But still, there's something to that. And then the telling of this story, the preserving of this story, there are things for us to know and take heart from. But before we talk about that, let me just make some observations about some similarities between the Genesis flood and the great Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the Gilgamesh tale was written probably 2,100 years before Genesis was committed to writing. And there's some similarities and some differences, real remarkable similarities. In fact, in the Babylonian tale, there's a champion, kind of like Noah. His name is Utnapishtim, and he was given advance warning that there would be a flood, and he was given instructions on how to make an ark that had dimensions measured out in cubits. His ark was kind of square, 120 cubits by 120 cubits. It had 6 stories instead of 3, like Noah's. And it rained for only 6 days, and on the 7th day came to rest. But Utnapishtim also sent out birds 3 times. He sent birds out to look for signs of life, that it was safe to leave, quite like Noah's. But there's some profound differences between the Babylonian tale and the one we find in Genesis. And in the Babylonian tale, the gods decide to flood the world to eliminate all of humans just because they're tired of them. They don't like noisy humans and the tricks that they get up to, so they just want to have them done with. Well, in Genesis, it's not humans who upset God, it's the perversion of humanity that troubles God. It says that the thoughts of their heart were only wicked all the time. God is distraught by that, and he wants to eliminate not humans, but the wickedness. Actually, the actions we see God take are as much to do with preserving humanity rather than wiping it out. And another big difference in this Gilgamesh tale is that when the gods stir up a storm, it frightens them. They're horrified by it. And in fact, we're told that Ishtar shrieked like a woman in childbirth. She was so frightened. Whereas, of course, in Genesis, Elohim, great God, is not frightened, but always in control, always attentive and mindful, watching the people that he has rescued out of that. Well, what are we to make of this story? What do we do with it? As I mentioned before, it's often an object of nursery tales or cute little animals and Happy Noah waving from the deck of the ark and giraffes and elephants, nearby. But to read this tale, it's really horrific, and there are things that really can be troubling about it. There are some things that continue to trouble me, but I think there's some theological truths we can take away from this. And one is this, that God is committed to carrying to completion a project that he began when he created humans in his own image and created them to be in fellowship with him. He wasn't willing to just kind of start that project and walk away from it when it went off the rails, but rather he wanted to intervene to preserve and keep this thing going. And he decided on kind of a radical start over with just a handful of folks. But that assures us that this is true. God provides a way out of trouble. We could imagine, and we've seen it ourselves at time when we want to turn away, or we see it in the lives of others, those who want to turn away commit themselves to their own path regardless of what the outcome might be. But God doesn't want us to just wander away, nor will he leave us to wander away. He provides a way through the storm to grant us access to him again. Now, it's interesting to note that in the ark, it's just a small door. Only 8 humans come through and a bunch of animals. It's not a lot being preserved in this. It's a small amount. There must be a joke here somewhere during this time of quarantine, of ourselves being trapped inside against a threat outdoors in a small space with just a handful of other people. I haven't quite figured out that joke, but it might have something to do with smelly animals and noisy places and wishing you could get out of doors sooner than you're able to. But the cool thing about Scripture, as we see that God, as he begins this process of calling people back to himself, it starts with this small little family, Noah's family. But then it grows to a larger family, Abraham's family. And that family grows into a whole nation that stands in covenant relationship with God. And then by the time we get to Christ, it's not just those few who can fit in the door of a small ark. It's rather Christ on the cross kind of opens his arms wide to all who would come his way. He says, all of you have new life in me. That's one of the differences between this New and the Old Testament, is God's progressive movement to include in his plan all of us who would come. Christ actually is throughout church history has been pointed to as a type or as an image of this salvation. The ark kind of symbolizing and pointing to Christ. The ark is the type or the anticipation of Christ, God's vehicle for saving humanity, both in Christ and also then the church. Later, theologians like Cyprian talked about the church being the mighty vessel, like an ark, that rescues God's people through the flood of our own wanton destruction. That's kind of the theological scope of it, but what about us, where we live? I wonder if you sometimes feel overwhelmed. I know that quite often it can feel overwhelming to me. I've thought this week of a song, you might be familiar with it, from Jars of Clay. This is let me read to you these lyrics you'll see on the screen there. First, just the verses. Rain, rain on my face. It hasn't stopped raining for days. My world is a flood. Slowly I become one with the mud. Downpour on my soul, splashing in the ocean. I'm losing control. Dark sky all around. Can't feel my feet touching the ground. Calm the stores that drench my eyes. Dry the streams still flowing. Cast down all waves of sin and guilt that overthrow me. And then this powerful chorus. If I can't swim after 40 days and my mind is crushed by crashing waves, lift me up so high that I cannot fall. Lift me up when I'm falling. Lift me up when I'm weak and dying. Lift me up. I need you to hold me. Lift me up and keep me from drowning again. This song by Jars of Clay was one of the first Christian songs to cross over from the small Christian world of music into the Billboard Top 100. In fact, that song took that album to platinum status and had kind of worldwide circulation. I'm sure you've probably heard it. And why so? Well, I think it's because so many of us can relate to that. This notion that the world around us is filled with chaos and destructive forces that we somehow can't get a foothold. It threatens to undo us. Or perhaps it's inside our heart and our mind, racing anxious thoughts or concern about things we can't control or what might happen next, or deep regret over what has already happened that we can't set right again. Thoughts and fears that threaten to overwhelm us. Have you ever felt that way? I know that I have, more than one occasion. It was a simple swimming pool when I was a child, but now those things have much more to do with world situations and inner spiritual dynamics in my own heart. The I was on a telephone or on a Zoom call like this. Actually, Gil Norwood was with me. We were visiting with the director of spiritual care at Beverly Hospital this week. And she talked about how that institution and the staff and sometimes feel overwhelmed. She said, we know how to do mass casualties. That's when the emergency department is flooded with people with injuries all at once, needing different types of care, and all hands are on deck. She said, we know how to do that. She said, but this is different. Now we have people constantly coming in the front door, and what they have threatens to convey to us as well. And more than that, we don't know when this will end. She said it's like endless, relentless mass casualty situation. She was exhausted. We could see it. Things are overwhelming. I want to leave, though, on giving you 3 hopeful images. One that's theological, one that's a little more cultural or from a world around us, and then one about the church. Just a few verses earlier in Genesis, actually Genesis 1, verse 2, it says this. We read that the earth was formless and empty, that is, it was without any order. Darkness covered the surface of the deep. It was just chaos, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the deep. Some theologians have referred to this deep, this unformed world, this world of chaos, as the pandemonium tremendum. This great sense of disorder. But in disorder, right at the very beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, there's chaos, profound, deep chaos. And yet that's exactly where God is. It says the Spirit of God hovered over the depth or broods over it. That brooding there is not a furrowed brow worry. It's rather like a hen with her chicks, hovering over it, protecting it, about to draw some order and beauty and creativity out of that. So know this, if there feels like the world is chaotic around you, God is near. God's not frightened by chaos, but rather chooses to create out of chaos. The next image is this one. Our friends at the hospital are overwhelmed with work, hard to get a break. Noah had a job to do. He didn't just get a word that a big kind of worldwide disaster was about to befall, but rather he was given a job to do, something meaningful that he set his hand to. And as I've talked to my friends who are physicians or others at the hospital, they say they're grateful for the opportunity to serve in such meaningful, life-changing ways. One way that we overcome fear and bring order to chaos is to give our hands to meaningful work in service of others. It's interesting. God could have done all kinds of things to save humanity, but instead he chose to use the work of human hands to build an instrument that would carry others and serve humanity going forward. Even though the world around us is chaotic and filled with unknowns, still the work we do to serve our neighbors in big ways and in small ways brings meaning and participation in God's work to heal this world. I have this slide of Here Comes the Sun. Whoops, we can go back to that one, Laura. Because at the hospital, we heard that every time now, and I think this is happening at different hospitals across the country, but certainly here in Beverly, every time a patient who has suffered from COVID-19 and recovered and is sent home, they play 10 seconds of this little song by George Harrison and the Beatles, Here Comes the Sun, a song of hopefulness and beauty. I think we can hold on to that. And here's this last image. This week, I think it was a Thursday or Friday, I'd spent most of the day in my study. I was reading all kinds of things and had my mind occupied on passages of the flood, thinking about that, thinking about the pandemic upsetting the world. It was a rainy day, and I was feeling a little down, feeling like this is just a dark time in the world, and I'm trying to hold onto hope, trying to find words of hope, but it seems like a challenge. And just then, it was 6 o'clock, and the bells from St. Mary's rang. I could hear them just down the street, clanging away. And this time, what filled my mind was not the image of church bells ringing melodically, but it seemed to me that this world around us was filled with chaotic floodwaters, but then floating over the top of them rang out a bell ringing. It made me think of a buoy out on the ocean, above the depths, ringing clearly and joyfully, signaling hope and safety and guidance and safe harbor. And it made me think of the church in this time, ringing out its bells of clarity, affirming hope and safety in the days to come. That is where our hope lies. God in his wisdom has decided the ark of today will be the church. We do this together. We survive together with one another in the church, growing in Christ. I hope that is of comfort and hope to you as we navigate the storms without and the storms within, and find faith to make our way through the flood. The final hymn for today is Christ Arose. You might be familiar with this one. It kind of starts on a low note and affirms the death of Christ, lying low in the grave. But then the chorus rings out triumphantly. It erupts with this joyful shout that death does not win, chaos doesn't triumph. Rather, Christ beats the grave, beats death, and so too offers new life to us. This time I promise to keep my mic off as Abby leads us in our final hymn. Let's sing together.